May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. You are the salt of the earth, Jesus says in Matthew's Gospel this morning. The phrase comes in the Sermon on the Mount, just after the Beatitudes. This is a phrase we all know, and that we hear, and maybe we even use. You are the salt of the earth. They are the salt of the earth. He, she is the salt of the earth. This is what we use to describe good, solid people. People who are kind. People who are truthful, responsible, and go out of their way to help others. But how does salt come to mean these good qualities? What do kindness, duty, and honesty have to do with salt? And how would salt, a mineral consisting primarily of sodium chloride, lose its saltiness and yet still be salt? In our beautiful Newport harborside location, it's interesting to note that the open ocean has about 35 grams, that's about 1.2 ounces, of solid salt per liter of water. And salt is an essential pivot point for our lives. There's no life without it, but too much of it is deadly. Our bodies need salt in hot, sweaty climates to hold fluids and to keep us alive. But too much salt causes or worsens hypertension, high blood pressure, which is life-threatening. So we have to watch our salty foods. The sea is another place where this pivot point exists. There's salinity, the salinity in the open ocean is about 3.5%, and animal and vegetable life, as you know, thrives there. But at the Dead Sea, one of the saltiest bodies of water in the world, and almost 10 times the salinity of the open ocean, the only thing living in the water are the native Palestinians, Jordanians, and Israelis, and all of the happy pilgrims who are rubbing the gooey, dark, rich mud over their skin and then enjoying and savoring the experience of floating sitting up. You know, that's the life in the Dead Sea. There's no other life than those bathers. The Episcopal Church now teaches a different theory of mission work, of missiology, as we call it, that's help for communities, whether they're here at home or places that are far from us. And it's different. The new theory is different from charity and different from just giving aid. It's called asset-based community development. And the idea with that is that you're lifting up local leadership, nurturing and releasing and empowering all the gifts that are at home. It's our new missionary model. The idea is to listen, to really hear what communities need, what they need to thrive, what they want, where their hearts are, what their passions are, what their culture is, and not to come in, arrive with our big bag full of our own ideas and our right way of doing things. This nurtures local leadership, and it allows the helpers, the missionaries, to become students of the community that they're helping, learning the culture and the needs of those who are there. And missionaries like this end up learning more than they can ever teach and receiving more in spiritual gifts than they could possibly give in terms of material gifts. One of the metaphors that is used in asset-based community development, which is referred to as ABCD, is the metaphor of the Sea of Galilee versus the Dead Sea. The Sea of Galilee is even today teeming with fish, St. Peter's fish they call them. And that's a kind of a bony but a lovely, delicate white fish, just delicious, usually served fried on a plate with its head on. And so there's all this fish and life, and the Jordan River flows down into the Sea of Galilee and sustains all of this wonderful life, and then it flows out the other end, still teeming with plant life and other nutrients, and into the Dead Sea. where it stops. Nothing ever flows out of the Dead Sea. And so that is the idea of this asset-based community development, because there's not an exchange, and because nutrients and life and sharing doesn't come out of the Dead Sea. That's the reason why it doesn't support life. There's no exchange and no life other than those happy pilgrims bobbing around in the water like corks I mentioned before. And it's the same idea for us, the salt of the earth. So when Jesus tells us, as he does in our gospel this week, you are the salt of the earth, what does that mean? And what do we do about it? It's always spoken with affirmation and respect, and it doesn't imply social status, wealth, academic degrees, any kind of professional attainment. It doesn't imply anything that stands still. It's about doing, and it's about acting. People who are the salt of the earth show up. People who are the salt of the earth do the right thing. They're kind. They're truthful. They think first of others. They're the backbone of the community, the people who get good things done. And Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. Interesting, right? He's not talking about other people. He's talking about those who are listening to him, and to us who are listening in through Scripture now. He's talking to us. We're the salt of the earth. The other thing I notice about Jesus' words is that the verb is in the present tense. He's not saying, if you follow me someday, if you're really good, you will become the salt of the earth. Or he's not saying, you used to be the salt of the earth until you messed up a little and didn't love your neighbor as yourself, and maybe you'll get back there someday, but not right now. He's saying you are the salt of the earth. But what do we do with that idea? We know now, today, that too much salt can give us high blood pressure and stress out our hearts. Too much salt can kill all life or prevent new life from growing. This, in fact, is another important use of salt, right? Before refrigeration, we salted meats to preserve them. It prevented bacterial growth from growing and spoiling the meats. Some have traditionally interpreted this verse from Matthew as the Christian responsibility as the salt of the earth to preserve purity out in the world. Salt was extremely important in Jesus' time, and ancient communities knew that salt was a requirement of life. And it was mostly used then as a preservative to preserve food. And it was important enough that salt was sometimes even used as currency and used to raise revenues and pay taxes. And as a commodity of great value, it was traded all around the Mediterranean. And it was even carried across the Sand Sea in caravans by camels. We get our word salary from these commercial uses. It was the portion of salt that was given to a Roman person. I find it a little more helpful in our context today to think about the salt of the earth and what salt does in a cooking sense. Like we're making a meal for our friends and our family. Salt is one of the most basic human tastes and one of the oldest seasonings, and it brings out the flavor of individual foods. It's not its own food. It enhances the flavor of fish. It brings out the complexity of a tomato, and it brings all those flavors out, having each shine, helping each to shine in its own way. So what do we do to act like the salt of the earth so that we stay on the right side of life's pivot point? If we're the salt of the earth, we have to be sprinkled out into the world, liberally distributed, nicely seasoning everything around us, bringing out all the special flavors, and not all gathered together in a salt shaker, just bottled up potential, but no action. We need to function like salt, one of the oldest and most ubiquitous seasonings, to bring out the best in others and to preserve and sustain life and not lose our saltiness by getting all concentrated in one place, like the Dead Sea. This last Thursday, Bishop Knisley installed a new rector at St. Matthew's Church in Jamestown, the Reverend Krista Levesque Moore. He preached at her installation an inspiring sermon, focusing on our call as Christians to get out into the needs of the world, to ask people what they need. Bishop Knisley was not preaching on this text that we have today, but asking others and considering what they need. What do those in government need? He met with the governor and the governor's staff. What do you need? How can we help as Christians? He'd met with hospitals. He'd met with schools. What do you need, he said. As Bishop Knisley said, asking others what they need and showing up sows love. And love heals and helps. This is how our communities are strengthened. And this is what the salt of the earth does when it's shaken out. At the end of his sermon, Bishop Knisley asked the new rector to stand. And she did. He said, I have a question for you. The question was, will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? What did Krista say? I will, with God's help. And then he asked us to stand. And he says, I have a question for all of you. And he asked the next question in our baptismal covenant that we said when we were baptized, or had said in our behalf, and that we say each time when we repeat our baptismal covenant in a baptism. He asked us, will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? And what did we say? We will, with God's help. As you might guess, salt relates directly to our baptismal covenant. Probably you all knew that already. Salt, as an item of great value and great price, seals deals. It seals covenants. And ancient Christians and Roman Catholics to this day placed a small amount of salt on the tongue of someone being baptized, even an infant, just several grains, to purify. It's part of the exorcism that is part of baptism, even in the Book of Common Prayer. And it's still in our Book of Common Prayer for the blessing of the water under occasional rites. The water is sometimes blessed back in the sacristy, and salt is placed in the form of a cross over the baptismal font. And this is the prayer. Almighty and everlasting God, you have created salt for the use of man. We ask you to bless this salt and grant that wherever it is sprinkled and whatever is touched by it may be set free from all impurity and the attacks of Satan. This is what the salt of the earth does. This is how we keep our saltiness, and how, if we've lost our saltiness, we can become salty again. It's about going and doing. It's just like Jesus' next words in Matthew's Gospel today. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under a bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. As the light of the world, which Jesus also says we are in today's Gospel, we must shine out. And as the salt of the earth, we must go out. We seek and we serve Christ in all persons, loving our neighbors as ourselves. We strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being. We do all that. Our reading from Isaiah today tells us, for what he calls the fast acceptable to the Lord. We loose the bonds of injustice. We share our bread with the hungry. and bring the homeless poor into our house. We shake ourselves out in love among our neighbors, helping where we can. And we drop generous pinches of ourselves into the great soup pot of our lives to increase the broth's savor. Amen.